Hello, my name is Teresa Scassa, and I'm the Canada Research Chair in Information Law and Policy at the University of Ottawa. My presentation today is number 4320, and it's titled Public Sector Use of Private Sector Personal Data Towards Best Practices. It's part of a panel that overall looks at, in fact, the private sector use of public sector data. So my topic is a little bit flipped, and I want to look at this other issue when it comes to the flow of data between public and private sectors. And so I am just trying to get my slides to move. There we go, sorry. All right, in terms of an overview, I'm going to frame this discussion around two examples of the public sector use of private sector data in Canada, where I come from, and each of these examples led to significant public outcry. And so I find them interesting to look at because I think it shows the examples of public response to problematic ways in which the public sector actors attempted to use private sector data. For example, one instance is the use of financial and credit data for national statistics by Canada's National Statistics Organization, Statistics Canada. The second example involves the use of mobility data, in fact, in this case, of mobility data analytics for public health purposes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of the issues that I'm going to look at with respect to these two examples of data collection are questions around the legal authority to collect or use the data, privacy, data protection and ethics, transparency, trust, and public engagement, and data quality and access. So the first example is the national statistics example. It's the use of personal, financial, and credit data for national statistics. And Statistics Canada, Canada's National Statistics Organization, had two projects that it was engaged in 2018. One of them had already begun. The other one was stopped in its tracks because of this controversy. The first one, and the one that had already started, involved compelling credit information about Canadians from a national credit reporting agency. And what StatCan was interested in were 600 data elements that included the name, age, date of birth, social insurance number, address, as well as data about types of credit obtained by consumers, amounts, activity, and balances. So a great deal of data. And the goal of the project was to get data on about 80% of the Canadian population. At the time the project was suspended as a result of this controversy, it had collected data related to 24 million Canadians. So it quite a significant amount of data in terms of volume, but also in terms of detail. The second project sought to obtain detailed personal financial data from banks and credit card companies. And so the objective was to get the detailed banking records of 500,000 Canadian households. The data sought were similarly rich in detail and volume, a great deal of information about consumer spending patterns as demonstrated by banking and credit card records. Now, this program never started because of the public outcry. In this example, there was really no prior public engagement. So the public, it came out of the blue for the public. They were not aware that this was going to happen. And I'm going to come back to this theme of public engagement because I think it's an important one. And although in the other example, the credit reporting example, TransUnion, the credit reporting agency, cooperated in providing data, the financial institutions in the second project actually resisted. And that resistance led to a media leak, and we can speculate where that came from. And that leak to the media led to coverage that sparked the public outcry. And that in turn triggered over 100 complaints to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, who launched an investigation and made findings. In the second example involving mobility data for public health purposes, Canada's Public Health Agency, in short PHAC, sourced mobility data analytics from two private sector companies, TELUS and Blue Dot, and this was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And aggregated mobility data was used by PHAC to monitor the trajectory of the pandemic and how best to respond to it. And this was the explanation given to a parliamentary committee by the Minister of Health. TELUS is a mobile phone service provider in Canada, quite one of the large mobile phone service providers. And it provided data analytics through a platform that it had established called Data for Good. And so the idea was that they had built this platform which provided analytics services in relation to its data where there was a public purpose for access to this data. And it was based on customer mobility data. So this was mobility data acquired from TELUS's cellular service customers. Blue Dot is a US-based analytics company that focuses on health. It provided analytics based on data of more uncertain pedigree. And I think this is important and is an important factor in this case. So it seems as if Blue Dot may have sourced its data from data brokers, sorry. So it may have sourced its data from data broker companies, and that raises some interesting issues about the legitimacy of the data that was used in those circumstances. In the mobility data example, like the StatCan example, there was no prior public engagement. There was some limited website transparency. So if you knew where to look, you could find information about the project. The media coverage in this case was particularly inflammatory and led to public outcry as well. There was also political polarization that contributed to the controversy. And I think this is something to think about where it's public sector uses of private sector data. There is always the potential that it become something that's used for political advantage by opposition parties and so on. So I think this is an interesting feature of this example. And the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, which is called ETHI for short, held hearings about the use of mobility data by PHAC and issued a report with recommendations. So that you see in both of these examples, they triggered some form of investigation and report, one by the Privacy Commissioner and the other by a parliamentary committee. So having set up those two examples, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that I have pulled out of these that I think are important. And the first one is legal authority. So obviously, if government is going to collect data about citizens, it needs to have some sort of legal basis for that data collection. For private sector actors, they can collect data from individuals if their actions comply with data protection law. But for public sector actors, they do need to have some sort of legal basis to collect the information. They can't just go out and hoover up information. And StatCan in this case relied upon rather dated provisions in the Statistics Act that referred to compelling access to a document or to a record. In other words, the statistical organization was empowered under the legislation to compel the production of a document or a record containing information that was necessary for the compilation of statistics. And so one of the issues in this case was whether that actually provided legal authority for the scale of data collection in this case, right? So this was basically harvesting data from massive databases and not from specific documents or records. And although on the one hand, you could say, well, this is just, quibbling about definitions and, as times change, you have to adapt to those changes. A legal provision that allows an organization like StatCan to compel data, is something that might need to be rethought, and the parameters of it might need to be rethought when you move from a records-based, paper-based records collection context to one where you're talking about significant databases. And so in this particular case, TransUnion, as I mentioned, had already provided data that it held about credit reporting data that it held about Canadians. And their view was that these were records because they didn't have to write new code or new script to generate the reports that they provided to StatCan. They would use the same techniques that they would use to generate credit reports for anyone who sought a credit report. And so the OPC, the Privacy Commissioner's report accepted that those were records that were collected by StatCan in the case of TransUnion. And, you know, I think that interpretation is open to debate, but that was the conclusion that they reached in that case. On the other hand, when it came to the financial data held by banks and credit card companies, the Privacy Commissioner was of the view that that didn't constitute a record. According to the financial sector, the financial companies, their data was held, the data that StatCan saw was held in multiple different databases that were separated both for operational purposes, but also for security purposes. And so there was no one single search or creation of a document or a record that you could do by pressing on a button or using a particular algorithm that, and so they argued that those data did not constitute a record or document, and the Privacy Commissioner agreed. And so what that meant was there was simply no legal basis for the collection of that data under the Statistics Act. In terms of the private sector companies, no issue was raised in this case about the legality of their collection of data from consumers, there was no challenge to that collection. But one question about legitimacy was whether they were permitted as private sector companies to share that data. And the private sector data protection legislation, which is in Canada is also quite antiquated, allowed for sharing without an individual's knowledge or consent for statistical purposes. And you have similar exceptions in the EU's GDPR as well. In the Canadian context, this was only permissive. In other words, it enabled companies to do this if they chose to, but it didn't require them to do it. And the way in which the provision is framed, at least in the Canadian legislation, certainly raises transparency concerns because it allows this to take place without knowledge or consent and there's no additional transparency requirement. Nonetheless, it's also still only possible for this to be done legally where the government entity has the legal authority to collect that information. And as we see in the case of the financial institutions in particular, the Privacy Commissioner had ruled that they did not have the authority to do that. In terms of mobility data, in the mobility data example, PHAC wasn't collecting personal data. It was actually seeking analytics based on data that was held by the private sector companies. And so in this case, it doesn't seem as if the Privacy Act is at all implicated. The people complained to the Privacy Commissioner, and the Privacy Commissioner indicated that he had launched an investigation. No report has yet issued, and it's not clear that the conclusion of that report could be anything other than they simply don't have jurisdiction because no data was collected, no personal data was collected. Both private sector companies argued that they had the legal authority to make use of the data for the purposes that they did in this case, taking their customer data and sharing it with a government agency in the form of analytics. The basis for this was consent. And so this is interesting too, because although TELUS obtained consent from its customers in its long, detailed privacy policy, there was a public sentiment that emerged from this example that the consent was not free and informed. And I think this is the classic problem we have with privacy policies, which is that, you know, individuals don't have time to read them all. And if they did, they wouldn't necessarily understand them. And so consent might be a basis for data collection or use, but how genuine is that consent? With Blue Dot, as I mentioned earlier, there was an issue about the consent pedigree. In other words, if they had in fact collected their mobility data about Canadians from data brokers, where did the data brokers get that data? And what was the nature of any consent that was provided with respect to that data? So how do you trace back the consent? And this is an issue that has arisen under the GDPR as well. But certainly under Canada's more dated legislation, this is much more complicated. And so it raises the question of whether in public procurement of data of this kind or data analytics of this kind, whether the pedigree of the data should be an element of any procurement. In other words, should the government entity that is procuring the analytics ask questions about where the data actually comes from and the extent to which the company can demonstrate that individuals actually consented to the collection of the data. So in this case, you could argue that there was technical legal compliance, but nonetheless, it still doesn't address the broader public concerns. And there's a growing reality that privacy and data protection alone is not a sufficient lens for such issues. And I think this is one of the important lessons learned from these examples, that even if you're privacy compliant, you may still not be satisfying public concerns over the public sector use of data collected in the private sector. And so another issue that arose in this context related to, or a bundle of issues related to privacy, data protection, and ethics. And I was just talking about the legal basis for collection, which of course is linked to data protection law. In the StatCan case, the privacy commissioner in the investigation of StatCan's practices proposed a necessity and proportionality framework for the use of private sector data in statistical programs in this way. It's not a legal requirement on the Privacy Act, which is out of date. The privacy commissioner is essentially saying, you know, the privacy context has evolved, and so even if this legislation is out of date, this is an appropriate analytical framework to adopt in Canada. The necessity and proportionality approach is much more common in the EU. And the statistical purposes exception in the GDPR invokes necessity and by implication proportionality in thinking about the exception. Necessity and proportionality would require StatCan to think more carefully about how much data it required to meet its purposes. And the privacy commissioner noted that the data only had to be sufficient to meet the public policy goals. The goal wasn't to have the most beautiful statistics, most perfect statistics possible, but just to have statistics that were good enough to serve the particular goals. And they were also concerned about the idea that this data would be retained for possible future uses and future purposes. It was also, the privacy commissioner was also interested in alternatives to demanding the transfer of data from the private sector. In other words, were there other ways in which insights could be derived from this data that did not involve the wholesale transfer of data from the private sector to Statistics Canada? And that, of course, was linked to cybersecurity dimensions in StatCan data collection, with the idea that if the statistical organization, which has good data practices and principles in place, if they started collecting large volumes of highly sensitive personal data of Canadians from private sector companies, they would make themselves much more of a cybersecurity risk target. And also there would be greater risks of internal breaches. And so the privacy commissioner looked at both of those considerations. They also noted that statistics that are generated from high quality, high detailed private sector financial data could lead to greater re-identification risk when combined with other data, leading to the re-identification of individuals just because of the quality and the nature of that data. They also flagged questions about opt-out possibilities. In other words, how could individuals who really didn't want their data to be used in this way, how could they choose to opt out of the use of their data for these purposes? Group privacy and data ethics issues also arose in this context and in the PHAC context. And I think that these are really important to think about. The necessity and proportionality framework was not specifically applied to the PHAC context, in part because no personal data was collected by PHAC, but it nonetheless could still provide a useful framework for assessing an overall approach to the use of group level data. And this requires the frame of analysis to be broader than conventional data protection or privacy issues. And so, for example, if you think about statistics as well as mobility data analytics, both of these, especially when used for public policy decision-making, can have very specific group impacts. They can be used, the outputs of these analytics can be used to make decisions about policy measures or benefits or policing, whatever the case might be, with respect to particular communities or particular groups. And so this therefore raises concerns about group privacy, but also about ethics, public engagement, and transparency. And an ethics-based approach might even find that compliance with basic data protection norms is simply insufficient, as I mentioned earlier, or inadequate, if the government purposes are not ones that were reasonably anticipated in the context of the data collection. In other words, when people use their credit cards, they're not thinking that the government is going to be collecting information about their purchases for statistical purposes. And so, a simple consent to collection and something in the privacy policy that says they may be shared for, public purposes or, whatever the case might be, isn't necessarily enough for that. And so that leads to the issue of transparency, trust, and public engagement. Prior public engagement, as I mentioned, was non-existent in both cases. Transparency was extremely weak. And in fact, both public entities relied heavily on private sector partners to provide notice about these uses, either in their privacy policies or in StatsCan's case, by putting notes on credit reporting files or on bank statements. And the Privacy Commissioner was quite critical of that. There was insufficient public engagement. And that lack of public engagement and transparency creates a risk of losing control over the messaging about such projects, which happened in each of these cases as the media ran wild with it and the public outrage grew. So how do you best ensure transparency? How do you inform or educate the public? These are important issues. As I mentioned in my paper, which will be eventually published, I hope, StatCan developed a trust center. How effective that was, I'm not sure. And then, of course, there are questions about what public engagement should look like, including prior public engagement. A final point about data quality and access, StatCan argued for a high volume of and detailed data to produce first-rate statistics. But as I mentioned before, the Privacy Commissioner was not convinced that this was necessarily the appropriate objective. But one of the issues then becomes, how do you measure what is required against the goals of the project? If you use privacy protective technologies, that may degrade the data quality, so the mode and nature of data collection is relevant. From a private sector perspective, there are also potential adverse reputational impacts or interference with customer relationships from collection of data by government. And in both cases, I think that was one of the consequences for the private sector organizations. There's potential reputational harm if there's a public outcry or if the government data usage is not considered acceptable. Compelled access, as was the case with StatsCan and the financial sector companies, can interfere with the confidentiality of business models, can interfere with secondary markets for data, as well as raise issues about cost recovery if this actually ends up being quite expensive. And so it's worth thinking about, higher privacy protection is sometimes characterized as a barrier to access, but it may just be a barrier to unconstrained access. And data protection could lead to innovation in new methods of data sharing and in public engagement around data sharing. And I think that should be one of the goals. And so very briefly, because I've taken a lot of your time, in terms of recommendations, prior public engagement is crucial. Notice and transparency are important features of that, but it can also involve consultation on project design and purposes. So it's not just after the fact notification that this is taking place, but it may require engagement of the public in the design. And that's certainly important to address group or collective impacts. Transparency has to be addressed both on the public and private sector sides, and it should address not just purposes of collection, but also issues such as opt-out. Data protection is important in this context, but it's not sufficient on its own, and strict legal compliance may simply not satisfy public concerns. And so the public sector needs to be thinking beyond data protection and thinking in terms of broader data ethics frameworks for data sharing. And new data sharing models or frameworks, which I haven't had time to get into here, may help address mutual concerns. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to the discussion at the conference.